Because of their special functions, the atlas and the axis differ in several ways from typical cervical vertebrae. As we've seen in Volume 3, a typical cervical vertebra has a body in front and a neural arch behind, enclosing the vertebral foramen. It has a spinous process behind with two tuberosities and a transverse process on each side, also with two tuberosities. On each side there are two articular surfaces, one above and one below, which form the intervertebral joints. The articular surfaces slope upward and forward. They're connected by this mass of bone, the articular pillar. Each vertebra is joined to its neighbors by an intervertebral disc in front and by two intervertebral joints behind, one on each side. Now let's look at ways in which the atlas and the axis are different. The atlas vertebra doesn't have a body. In front, it just has this narrow anterior arch, which matches the posterior arch. The two arches of the atlas, together with these two lateral masses, enclose an unusually large vertebral foramen. This part is occupied by the spinal cord, this part by the odontoid process of the axis, which we'll meet in a moment. The upper articular surfaces of the atlas are shaped like parts of the inside of a cup, to match the shape of the occipital condyles. The lower articular surfaces of the atlas are shaped like parts of the inside of a cone. Now let's look at the axis vertebra. The body of the axis is prolonged by this important projection, the odontoid process. In terms of development, the odontoid process represents the missing body of the atlas. In terms of function, it's the pivot around which the head, together with the atlas, rotates. The upper articular surfaces of the axis are placed well in front of the lower ones. The upper surfaces are in a straight line with the odontoid process. As rotation occurs between these surfaces and those of the atlas, the odontoid process stays in the middle. The odontoid process is surrounded in front and on each side by bone. It's held in place behind by a strong ligament, the transverse ligament of the atlas. The odontoid process is also held in place from above by two strong ligaments, the alar ligaments, which are attached here and here. We'll see these ligaments shortly. The odontoid process has two small articular surfaces, one behind for the transverse ligament and one in front for the anterior arch of the atlas. To see how these structures relate to the base of the skull, we'll take an inside look from behind at a specimen in which the neural arches and the back of the occipital bone have been removed. Here's the foramen magnum. Here's the inside of the basal part of the occipital bone. Here's the atlas. Here's the axis. Here's the odontoid process. Here are the atlanto-occipital joints and the atlanto-axial joints. Now that we've seen the atlas and the axis, we'll look at the bones below them that are involved in support and movement of the head. The lowest cervical vertebra, the seventh, articulates with the highest of the 12 thoracic vertebrae. The two first ribs slope downward and forward from the first thoracic vertebra. The costal cartilages of the first two ribs articulate here with the upper part of the sternum, the manubrium. The manubrium, the first ribs, and the body of the first thoracic vertebra form the margins of this opening, the superior thoracic aperture, through which many important structures pass. To complete our picture of the bones in this section, we'll add the clavicles and the scapulae. On each side, the clavicle articulates with the highest part of the manubrium to form the sternoclavicular joint. The sternocleidomastoid muscle is inserted here. The scapula is attached to the clavicle here, at the acromioclavicular joint. In addition, the scapula is held in place by powerful muscles, the highest of which, the trapezius, arises here on the skull and is inserted here. Now let's move on to look at the ligaments that connect the skull and the cervical vertebrae. Like ligaments elsewhere in the body, these structures hold the bones together, permit the bones to move in relation to one another, and set limits to their movements. We'll look first at the structures that permit movement between individual vertebrae, the intervertebral discs and the intervertebral joints. Then we'll look at three ligaments that run the length of the cervical spine, the nuchal ligament and the anterior and posterior longitudinal ligaments. Lastly, we'll look at the special ligaments around the odontoid process. Here's what the cervical spine looks like in the living body. Here are the spinous processes, the articular pillars, the transverse processes, and the vertebral bodies. The intervertebral joints are here. They're synovial joints. To get a better look at them, we'll make a cut through the articular pillars along this line. As with all synovial joints, each bony surface is covered by a layer of smooth articular cartilage. The space between the cartilages is filled with lubricating synovial fluid. The fluid is contained within a fibrous joint capsule, which permits movement. Between each vertebral body and its neighbor, there's an intervertebral disc. To see the discs, we'll make a cut in the midline. The discs are made of fibrocartilage that's attached firmly to the vertebra above and below. The fibrous joints formed by the discs permit only a little movement between the regular cervical vertebrae. The movements that can occur between these vertebrae are forward flexion, extension, and a twisting movement that's a combination of rotation and lateral flexion. In the intervals between the occiput, the atlas, and the axis, where so much movement occurs, there are no discs, only synovial joints. Now we'll look at the three ligaments that run the length of the cervical spine, starting with the nuchal ligament. Here's the nuchal ligament, also called the ligamentum nuchae. It's a sheet of strong fibrous tissue that extends from the spinous process of the first thoracic vertebra to the external occipital protuberance. The nuchal ligament limits forward flexion of the head and the cervical spine. It also serves as the attachment for some major muscles. Next, we'll go round to the front to see the anterior longitudinal ligament. This broad band is the anterior longitudinal ligament. It runs the whole length of the vertebral column, connecting the fronts of the vertebral bodies. It ends up here, at this tubercle on the arch of the atlas. The anterior longitudinal ligament is not as impressive in the neck as it is lower down. In the neck, the ligament that's impressive is the posterior longitudinal ligament, which runs down the backs of the vertebral bodies inside the vertebral canal. To see the posterior longitudinal ligament, we'll remove the arches of the vertebrae and also the back of the skull along this line. The spinal cord and the brain have been removed, together with the covering layer of dura. Here's the base of the occiput. Here's the foramen magnum. Here are the divided vertebral arches. This is the posterior longitudinal ligament. It's much broader and thicker here in the neck than it is lower down the spine. The highest part of this ligament goes by a different name. It's called the tectorial membrane. To get a different view of it, we'll look at a specimen that's been divided in the midline. Here's the foramen magnum. Here's the anterior arch of the atlas. Here's the odontoid process.